Welcome to the South and Sideways podcast on the Urban Sentinel channel. I am your host, the Urban Sentinel. This is podcast episode 07, False Flags and Conspiracy Theories. Well, let's get into it. False flag and conspiracy theories pretty much says it all. We have in our history, and we'll just focus on U.S. history, many times that the truth and the reality aren't the same thing. Conspiracy theories, for the most part, really stem first and foremost from lack of information or lack of truthful entire information. Most of what we consider in our modern day society of conspiracy theories comes down to the people that either know or have the actual truth of the situation have not disclosed all the information. You can see that there are pieces missing, and simply inquiring as to, hey, this little bit of information seems to be missing from this timeline of events. Perhaps you can enlighten us. And you either get no answer, you get classified, or whatever the excuse is. And of course, there will always be those supporters of that narrative that simply say the truth is there, you just can't accept it. And in some cases, yes, the truth can be disappointing, but when it's disappointing, you know that it's always the truth, because more often than not, nothing is as exciting as we want it to be in our imagination. But when you do have certain scenarios, when you do have certain situations that just seem to be beyond coincidental, that too many things happen by chance, by accident, in a particular sequence of events, but yet by those that would be the ones in authority, by those that would be the ones in the know, it's deemed as nothing at all. It's not even worth looking at. And that's where we're, I'd say, stepping into right now. False flags and conspiracies. Now, with a false flags can be looked at in many ways, but the two most common ways that they're often seen, you either get rumors of some type of event or incident that might occur. Nothing definitive, just, oh, this might happen because of. Or you get a series of events that do occur, but something's not lining up the way that it should to make it seem natural and organic. Even, yes, a planned attack by a terrorist group is a planned attack by a terrorist group. They, as the terrorist, have to know what their target is, how they're going to assault the target, what their goal is, what are they willing to accept as losses, are they willing to call it off if certain things happen before the attack, are they willing to look for a different target, a backup target, should they not be able to make that. Yes, there is a certain level of planning on their end, but their actions create an organic reaction from everybody else. Even people where it's their job to respond to terrorist attacks on different levels, even before knowing that it's a terrorist attack, everything else, the reaction is organic. And you spot a false flag in certain situations where the reaction is less organic than what it should have been. When you have situations where you hear about police, law enforcement conducting annual training drills, you don't think anything of it. And you hear about agencies working together. So you might have 2 or 3 federal law enforcement agencies working with a state agency, their state police force, and some county and local police, and maybe the EMS and firefighters, whatever it is, doing a training of, let's say you have, a toxic chemical train spill. It happens. But then when a few weeks later, maybe a few months later, you have that exact event that happens in that area or someplace nearby, you think initially, well, it's a good thing they trained and practiced for that. But then you also start to think, it's kind of funny how they did that training and practice, and then a few weeks later, it actually happened. Now, that is not to say that every single accident that occurs or any type of incident that occurs is part of a false flag, is part of a heads up, this is what's going to happen. Absolutely not. And I am not pointing fingers at any particular person or group stating that they knew ahead of time. In many cases, that's not the situation. I will use, and you can take it for what it is, as an example, 9/11. That's something that for definitely people of Gen X and Boomer generation, silent generation, we are well aware of. Millennials, to one extent, depending upon when they were born. Gen Z, not as much. It's all history for them. So it's all short snippets and video clips, and it really doesn't have the same impact and weight that it does for people who were alive when it actually happened. And when you look at the tragedy as it was, a planned terrorist attack, it's just that. It's only when you start to raise your hand and question a few things that still exist out there that make you think that perhaps there was something else. And I can get blowback for this, but when you have a British news reporter who is reporting on the entire attack in New York City as it's going on and makes a statement about the collapse of building number 7 within the World Trade Center plaza, and over that reporter's shoulder on the screen, you can clearly see building number 7 still standing. And then 45 minutes later, that building collapses. You think, well, that was kind of odd because all the buildings are numbered. Every single one of them within the World Trade Center plaza has a number. You had towers 1 and 2, and then the subsequent buildings 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I believe there's an 8 or a 9, but I can't recall. It's been a while. But all of those buildings and their locations also make a difference. Building 7 was not in between buildings 1 and 2. It was not immediately adjacent to either one. It was, in fact, I'd say realistically, a good 2 New York City blocks away. But yet somehow that building by itself, not the buildings in between and not the buildings next to it, and not just the World Trade Center buildings, but the other buildings on that area around that block, nothing else was affected. Nothing else collapsed. All the other buildings were fine. To find that that happened in the initial attack, you are overwhelmed with emotion. You're trying to process this entire thing. But when you step back and you look at it and you think, well, that was just a one-off incident. But then you think about the other things. They identified the terrorists, the 19 terrorists on those flights. They identified them because they found passports, they found photo IDs. And you say, okay, that's perfectly reasonable. You know, checking the manifest for the flights of all the people that are on there, and then they find these guys. And then you think to yourself, well, they were on the planes. The planes exploded, burned completely, incinerated, gone, metal melted. But yet their passports, which are made of nothing but laminated wax paper and plastic, survived well enough that you could visually ID. You could see the photo and you could read the name. But no one else's. Nobody. Again, something that in that moment, you're emotional about it. It was a tragic event. You're overwhelmed trying to process it. Your brain has probably shut down and reverted to a 3-year-old hiding under their blankets away from the imaginary monster coming out the closet. But when you look at it from time and distance, you think that's not possible. It doesn't make sense for an ID that's made of common materials to survive that intense level and duration of fire, and then to be found amongst literally metric tons of dust and debris from skyscrapers several hundred feet high. I mean, needle in a haystack would be far, far easier with mittens on than it would to find something like that. But yet, again, it's simply, the diligence of the excavation crew and the workers is what led to it. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. When you think about all of the other connecting bits of information around that, again, you look at the footage that was shown at the Pentagon, Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. at that time period was, in the United States, the most heavily surveilled city ever. Cameras pretty much on every federal building, inside and outside and around the perimeters. Why? Security, plain and simple. You're going to have security cameras on the buildings facing out, so you see what's around it. You're going to have cameras in the parking lots facing in to see what's in the parking lot. You're going to have cameras across bridges and overpasses and highways to see all the lanes of travel and everything that is immediately around it. But yet only one shot of one quick blur hitting the side of the Pentagon in an area that, just by coincidence, had only just recently been remodeled. So there were not any active offices in that location. It was completely empty for regular workers in that particular section. Coincidence? Again, it is what it is. Now, I say this only because where we're at presently, and again, when you're in the present moment, it's hard to see without emotion. We're at a point where we have a former president who is awaiting an actual sentencing for crimes that were committed prior to taking office. We have a current president who, no matter how you feel about it, is an older person, but he's an older person with the physical attributes of someone who is not going to be long on this earth. And I am not wishing ill will. I'm just simply stating the fact. We all reach a point in our lives where our bodies say we've had enough and it's time to go. His is just more notable because he can be on camera in front of millions of people at any point in time and have one of those senior moments far beyond just being an adorable grandpa type situation, but being more concerning to maybe we should get him to a facility type of situation. We have an election coming up. That the election by itself is, again, contentious because we have the only two candidates, the only two players on the team, both of which are equally not liked by a large group of people, both of which are equally questionable in their ability to actually get anything done, and both of which, without being too overly dramatic, if either one should make the points that they need, you're going to have a large swath of this nation completely irate over that fact, and that will then lead to many of the problems that we've been luckily enough avoided on a large scale. Small scale, no. Large scale, yes. Now, with that being said, here's where false flags could possibly come into it. We've already been fed the narrative that you have one group of supporters that if the sentencing is too harsh, too intense, that, you know, they're going to riot. They're going to be up in arms about it. And then, of course, their opposing group that if the sentencing and the sentence given is not harsh enough, it is not justifiable enough for whatever the reason is, they're going to be up in arms about it. So right off the top, you already have scenario number one, the sentencing in July. If that does not go in one direction definitively, there's going to be problems from an opposing group, because in August you have the Democratic National Convention where they officially and formally recognize their candidate that they are going to support for the President of the United States. Now, normally when you have the incumbent, the person who's already there, if it's only their first term, they get the automatic support for their second term. But if you have a situation where that candidate is showing that they are less capable and perhaps more of a liability, that may put that convention at a point where they want to suggest someone else, and they can do that. Now, with that being said, they would only do that if they knew for a fact that the opposition, the challenger, was out of the picture, because they don't want to risk pulling support for their already seated president and putting it behind someone that maybe not everyone is on board with, only to have that person lose in the race against the challenger. Now, if the challenger is completely out of the race, and you might say, well, they won't be able to do that. They might, because states still have rights. And if a state has within its laws, when it comes to elections, that any person who has been accused of, tried, and convicted of felonies, and they are on the voting roster, the voting polls for an elected position, whether it's local, whether it's state, or whether it's a national election, shall not receive elector votes. You may only need 2 or 3 states that have that rule. You may only need 2 or 3 states that make that a rule before the actual election occurs, in which case that would minus electoral votes that the first candidate could potentially get. So even if they garnered support and they were able to run, they just won't have enough electoral votes to make that number that they need to claim victory. And then whatever little points the other side has, they'd be able to walk away with it, because it would come down to, I believe, a congressional majority vote at that point to make that determination. And they would simply look at the total number of electoral votes and say, well, they both fell short, but the incumbent still had more. Now, if it comes down to posing a new challenger for the Democratic Party, they would definitely want to pick someone that they can get knee-jerk reaction to and get a large swell of support, not just simply from people who vote the party line, but from people who kind of sit in the middle or move to one side or the other, depending upon where the tide is taking them. In which case, that again, you could have a scenario or a situation where what is seen to be members of the extreme right are taking actions that are unsavory and taking actions that are hostile towards the democracy. They don't have to be clearly defined. It just simply has to be, you have to point at a group and say, that's them, the extreme right, they're doing that. And I'll give an example. There was, not that long ago, a U-Haul truck that had at least 12 members, maybe more, of some radical right-wing group. They were getting ready to stage a potential protest. They were surrounded by law enforcement. Law enforcement found out where they were. They found out the vehicle that they were in. They found out everything they needed to, and they surrounded the truck. And, you know, you see photographs. They've got them, you know, guns drawn, bring them out the back of the U-Haul truck. And these guys are all, you know, they're looking fit. They're, you know, they're 5'10" to 6'1", good build on them, khaki jeans or khaki pants, you know, matching shirts and matching ball caps and balaclava face masks, and they're all stepping out, and, you know, there's footage of them, you know, they're lockstep moving in synchronicity, and they're all professionally grade badasses, and you think to yourself, well, that is not what I expected from the extreme right wing. But what you may find really funny is that in all the photographs with all the police surrounding them, and they've got them on their knees, they've got their hands up, they've got them zip tied, they're still masked. Now, maybe policies have changed. Maybe there's something new that people are unaware of, but you rob a bank and you've got a mask on and you run outside and the police are out there, they're waiting for you, they catch you, you know, drop the gun, put your hands up, you do all that, down your knees, put your hands on top of your head, you do all that, they come over, they cuff you, that's done. They take your mask off. Why? Because they want to see who the hell you are right then and there, because you might be a person of interest that they were already looking for, or you might have been an accomplice to some other criminal act, and they go, hey, this person was also someone that we have noted in this other crime that occurred. But they want to get an ID on you right away because there may be a situation where you might not be the only one. But yet those people remained unidentified through that whole entire process. Now, the conspiracy on that is that those, you know, well-fitted extreme right ringers were not who they were. They were not the bubbas with the beer guts. They were not the, you know, the yokels that are vocal. They were possibly part of some type of law enforcement group in a staged false flag situation to give the appearance that, you know, people are up to no good. And swinging the pendulum on the other side, even in situations where you had the protests that were going on from 2016 through 2020, where a lot of it just simply, the protests that were mostly peaceful were really just glossed over and glorified riots, because that seemed to be the predominance of what was going on. Protests in the daytime while the cameras are there, and then as soon as there are fewer camera people around, things just went batshit crazy. And people started questioning things, and people started bringing up information that there were small pockets of protesters that were actively doing acts of violence. Now, you can say, well, that's an isolated thing. That's not the whole group. And definitely it's not to say that people that were protesting for a particular movement are all responsible. But you also have to think that if there's 20, 30, 300 of you in a group all protesting for a certain civil right, a certain level of equality, and then there's one person in that group that's throwing rocks, smashing car windows, that maybe you go, hey, you mind not doing that, because that's not what we're here for. That's not what we're about. I understand that you're angry and upset, and we all are, but you're not actually helping our situation by destroying things. And also, you're in our neighborhood, destroying our neighborhood. That makes exactly zero sense whatsoever. But these things happen, you know, magically speaking, as it were. Hundreds of protesters turning up in busloads, by the busload, not city bus, but by chartered bus, to many of these events. You don't randomly, organically just have people show up like that. If people are going to show up, they're coming in, you know, piled into their, you know, Mazda Miatas, you know, 6 deep, sitting on each other's lap, because they want to get down there and be part of history. They want to be part of the protests the same way their grandparents were. They want to be able to be in there and be vocal about it. They don't go and then call up a random bus company saying, hey, do you happen to have 5 charter buses, coach buses available to rent for this impromptu protest that we're going to tomorrow? And bus companies go like, oh yeah, sure, no problem. Something like that takes weeks, months even, to pull off. So it's not to say that, no, protests are not organic. They are. When you can have a protest spring up and it starts. And you can plan a protest. You can say, okay, we're going to have a rally here. We're going to have a rally there. But for some of those events, when you start having people coming in where the protest was only announced 3-4 days earlier, and you have that many people showing up, and somehow things go a little wanky, a little sideways during the protest, causing more problems, it puts a particular frame or light in that area and it says, hey, maybe they're protesting, and then maybe a large group of them are just out to cause chaos and, catastrophe. With this election, expect to see something along those lines. Expect to see naturally protests. People are going to be opposed one way or the other, but then expect to see more chaos, more disasters, more confusion. Because now the process would be, if there is a large onset, a swell, a surge of demonstrations that do get a little out of control, that do cause destruction, that do cause harm, that are brewing and breeding violence, what's a government to do? A government is to crack down. I mean, again, example, and again, only conspiracy, blowback on this, but it is what it is. You had a large, growing level of protests in China. Chinese people had had enough of the government. They had enough of the communist regime. They had enough of the oversight, overwatch, overreaching control. They had enough of the infringements on themselves, on their rights, the lack of legal rights and protections from the government. They were massing, and the masses were spreading. And it was reaching a point, like in other places, if you remember the Arab Spring, where once it hits that critical point, the government becomes helpless to do anything about it because it has gotten so large and so pervasive that it is everywhere. We had a virus, plain and simple. The government locked it down and said, oh, there's a health crisis, no more protests. Protests are illegal. It's a health and safety concern. So the government cited a health and safety issue and clamped down on the individuals' rights to protest. Now, granted, their right to protest completely different than in the United States, the right to protest, but the principle is still the same. You can't say, well, I'm going to eliminate your right to protest against a government action or against any type of action, but I will throw in an Uno reverse card and claim that there is some public health and safety issue that is greater than your individual right or your collective right to be loud and proud about something that you believe in. Something like that can happen, and you can now force lockdowns under numerous conditions. You can force local lockdowns. You can have a person at large that is of interest and is a safety risk to other people. So you need to lock down this area while they look for them. If you think about the Boston bombers, to one extent, it makes sense on paper. The two bombers, they were identified as being those two individuals. They knew in general where they were. They locked the city down, calling all cars, put out the dragnets, and then they proceeded to go house by house, street by street, pulling out family members, people, individuals, getting them out, hands up, on the sidewalk, on your knees, searching them, searching garbage cans, going through everything. Now, yes, they did find the one bomber, the younger brother of the two, hiding in someone's boat. So it's not to say that searching every nook and cranny was unreasonable, but it is to say the very actions and activity and the location where they found that person in relation to all the other neighborhoods that they searched were far removed in one extent from where they actually were. It's far easier for an authoritative body to claim there's a threat, there's a danger, so we need to take immediate action and we need to remedy the situation. And our methods might seem extreme now, but in hindsight, you will be justified by the activity that we did. And that was the situation there. So it's not to say that that won't happen again. And if you have a situation where the threat of democracy, the integrity of the elections is presumed to be in jeopardy, certain actions, again, might be taken. Now, this can go multiple ways. This can go as a way to leave the current administration in charge, keeping them basically sitting in the seat until the danger has passed. This could be a way to make a disruption in the current status quo and then bring in someone to replace the current administration under a veil of, amenities that, oh, we're doing this only for this reason and not for that reason. That reason being, let's say, Article 25. The Article 25 for the Constitution basically allows the Congress to remove the president if they are unfit to serve as their position of president of the United States. And by default, in the chain of succession, the vice president becomes the president of the United States, but only for the remainder of that presidential term. So it's not a case of the current vice president would become the president for the next 4 years. It would be, if Article 25 were placed in effect, that vice president would become the president for the remaining part of that term. So that would be through the end of this year, past the election. Now, if you wanted to ensure, again, that you're running against the challenger and you've got a winner, but you don't have the time to do the appropriate campaigning, you don't have time to do the state by state, to shake the hands and to pat the people on the back, you just need to say, hey, we found a replacement and you need to put them up there. I'm putting down on the bingo card, and this is just me, again, my own speculation. I'm putting down on the bingo card a combination, Governor of California, Gavin Newsom, and the former First Lady, Michelle Obama. Now, you can say that'll never happen. He's not running for president, and she doesn't want to be involved in that. Absolutely true. And again, I'm not some insider. I'm just me thinking the way that I think. But if you're trying to ensure that your party retains control during the election because you know that your current leader is faltering and may not make it health-wise to the election, you can't risk your challenger taking advantage of that. So you need a Sherlock popular winner. You need someone that is name brand known, but you also need a combination of someone that has run things the way that you run, that runs the same playbook because that's the team that they play for. And that's my combo pick for that. Now, whether it be Newsom as president with Obama as vice president, or Obama as president and then Newsom as the VP, either way, that's going to be a winning combination, because if you have VP Harris taking over as acting president or as the president for that remaining part of the term, and then the Speaker of the House becomes the default VP for that period of the term, once they put those up and run, they're going to landslide victory over any challenger whatsoever. Even if the current challenger, Trump, is no longer in the picture, anyone else that the Republican Party puts up is going to fail miserably against that combination. With that being said, it also goes the other way. If, in fact, the sentencing is time served, or it is no longer an issue with house arrest, that effectively they're not taken off the polls, if Trump is still left on the voting roster and receives the electoral votes needed, like it or not, that's the way that goes. And against the current president, the incumbent, if he continues to have the issues that he's had, and they're small issues, but they're small issues that keep getting closer together in frequency. That's the problem. You can easily point at any person and say, well, this person messed up on this and they messed up on that. That happens. That's humans. But the frequency of those issues keeps getting closer and closer together. And if you are an individual that has had the experience of having an older parent or grandparent go through some of the same situations, the memory loss, the disorientation, the incoherent conversations that go on, the changes in the bodily functions that happen as you get older, all those things start building up, and eventually it gets to the point where it goes from once in a while where you almost don't notice it to a regular basis, to you come to the house and you're wondering what is going to be wrong inside that house when I walk in, what is going to be, messed up when I start looking at things. People that know this, that understand this, they don't have ill will towards their family member. They just know that it is part of people's lives and it does happen. But it also is at a certain point where that's when you start looking at home health care and getting them into a nursing facility, or, signing them into a clinic, whatever it is. They are no longer able to be on their own because they cannot function on their own properly. You can't turn your back on them because they will go off and do something quite nutty that from their perspective, they either have no idea that they're doing it or it seems perfectly natural for them. And you don't want that in a person that is going to be making decisions. Now, yes, there's always the comical farce of, he could press the nuclear button. And we all know that, reasonably speaking, that is absolutely impossible to do. Even if a person with dementia were to hit the button, there is no single button. There is no, it just launches to launch. There's a series of steps that have to take place. But having conversations, having treaty talks, having trade agreements going on, leaders of nations often confer with other leaders of nations first. Yes, their prime ministers and their secretaries of state and all the other functioning parts of the bureaucracy are the ones that actually get the work done. But oftentimes that initial step first comes with that phone call, with that sit down face to face, where one leader stares at the other leader across from their table and says, look, this is what we're bringing to the table. Literally, this is what we want from you. If you can't do that, we'll go to somebody else. If you have a person who is in charge and they're sitting at the table and they are not in a mentally capacitated state to make those decisions one way or the other, and they see it, and in many cases, it does come down to a primal thing. We as people, human beings, understand strength and we understand weakness. We understand something that is bold and upfront, and we also understand something that is quiet and demure. When you see a person that is supposed to be the leader of a country behaving in a confused, maybe, slightly off-put manner, not quite sure what's going on, you have less confidence, even though you know that they are the ones not actually doing the work. But ultimately, are they making the right decision? One, that isn't going to be somehow countermanded by the rest of their staff, by the bureaucracy that they're in charge of, because it was a bad decision. Or two, are they even aware of exactly what is going on, and are you wasting your time in this negotiation? Because no one likes to do that. But also too, in the opposite sense, people don't like someone who brags too much. People don't like someone who talks the big talk all the time, because again, you can talk a big talk and you can walk around with your chest puffed out, but when it comes down to it, if you're still not bringing the game, you're not bringing the game. That's the whole thing. And then you fall back on, well, this, that, and the other is the reason why, but no one wants to hear that. So when it comes to a national level, people as a whole in their own country and other countries want to see, at least on some level, competent and capable leadership that isn't going to be too far to the extreme in either end. And if you have questionable scenarios, you're going to end up in that situation where things need to be happening on that game board, because all these pieces are all moving. The narrative is written out. It's like watching a stage play from on top of the stage, looking down above it. You can see things moving. You can see where they're all standing on their marks, and you know where they're going to be moving for their next set and everything else like that. And you watch it happen. But when you're in the audience, you're only seeing what is presented. You only know what's going on. And when something pops up from stage left or from stage right, it's a surprise to you. And then your attention is over there. And then you don't notice set pieces being pulled into the back curtain and new pieces being slid out, or the lighting has changed, focused from the spotlight on that one event over there, that one trigger event, to a new scene someplace else. And with the false flags as they are, they can often look like something that is completely normal and natural, because it doesn't have to be a finger snap immediate in that moment. It could be something that is being built up a little bit at a time. You might hear a news story about some salmonella or E. coli, something in a food processing center, some bacteria. You might hear some report about a defective part on an airliner that is linked back to this manufacturing company. All these small little things by themselves may not seem like much, but then when the narrative starts chaining certain things together, that, the defective part came from materials that were sourced from this location, and it turns out that material is being used in X, Y, and Z for this type of transportation, these types of machinery, and these type of parts. So all of these things need to be recalled. Those chickens that were infected with that disease weren't localized to that infection. They were actually infected by a migratory bird, which now has been found in these locations and these locations. And now the bacteria has had time to settle in. So we have to cull, 20 million chickens across these areas, raising the cost of food up. Small little things that do happen can be exploited, even if only in narrative, to make it seem larger, and linking them together in certain combinations, you can then build a crisis mode where now when people realize that a lot of things are going on at once, it's like they say, juggling too many plates all at once. You start having all these different things going on. You're trying to maintain and manage it. You envision yourself a food server at a restaurant doing just that. They've got 4 plates on one arm. They've got 2 trays in the other hand, and they're moving around to get through all the tables to get to a location. And you're watching and you're thinking, it's going to fall, it's going to fall, it's going to fall. And maybe it doesn't. Maybe it gets there. Maybe they're good at what they do and they get all the trays, all the food there at once. But it's the fact that there's so much going on that one thing goes wrong, everything goes wrong altogether. And with 2024 being the year, as it is, it's the year, that is bound to happen. Now, I am not a prediction maker, and I can definitely say that I can look back at many of my videos where I predicted, as it were, in air quotes, that this event would happen in the next 6 months, and it didn't, or this might happen in the next 2 months, and it didn't. And like I said, I have more cases where the timeline is completely off, or the event did not happen to the extent that I described it and envisioned it. I'm perfectly fine with that. It could be July, it could be August, and nothing spectacular happens. The November election may actually come and people are holding their breath, and then, the day after the election, the numbers are in, and people are like, yeah, those are the numbers, and nobody contends it. And we have whoever we have as president going into the next year, and it's a nothing burger, absolutely nothing, just bread and air, not much more. And I'm perfectly fine with that. I'm also perfectly fine that if things do go wrong, if they do go south and sideways, it's not a matter of saying, I told you, I knew it, because I really don't know it. I'm just looking at the history of events and how certain things seem to have a cycle, a certain frequency, that when you step back and you look at the broader picture, you can kind of see that pattern. You can see it kind of build up. And we're at that point where it's starting to build up, and we're starting to see little things now that will become big things later on. Even in terms of fuel, the cost of gas is going back up again. Not as significant as it had done just a few years ago, not even 3 years ago. It started jumping up, but it's still going up again. But people are used to that because it's going up so incrementally small, no one's paying attention. But then if you have a situation where suddenly oil reserves become in question, if you have another pipeline incident where cyber hackers shut down pipelines, or there's a physical attack on a pipeline, that can dramatically change things. You look at our food reserves. We had a drought situation going on in much of the Midwest and the Western states for quite a while, and then they got a deluge from the El Nino over the last several weeks that may or may not have brought them out of that drought. And that's the key thing. It may have brought them up to safe levels, but now the intense heat may literally start evaporating all of that water faster than it can basically be used to replenish a lot of the soil that was hardened by being in a drought. They may be in a situation where that excess rain and all that moisture might be causing problems of bacteria growth within the soil, and so food production could still be affected. There are many things that can go on that are very subtle, very small, that by itself is just something that could be seen as a one-off. But when certain things are pushed in a direction and then they're amplified by outside sources, where there just simply be a whisper in the ear, did you hear? Yeah, I think this is going to be the thing that does it. Or whether it be something that's actually out, open and obvious, where people go, oh, this is real. This is actually happening right now, and we need to be ready for it. That changes the dynamic, because human beings, no matter what, we are all individuals, but we can all quickly, by instinct, form into collectives, form into those groups. As they say, great minds think alike, yes, but it's more like minds think alike. It doesn't necessarily mean that your idea is the right idea just because someone else agrees with you. It just simply means whatever your thought process is, you and several other people are all on that same train. Now, whether you figured it out and you have the actual correct answer or not is a totally different situation. But I say I expect a little bit of chaos and a little bit of calamity building up from July going through August, heading into November. And that is on the internal side. Now, we're not even going to discuss externally what's been going on, because that, again, plays into a whole different level of situation. When you say, well, what would be the end result? Who the hell knows? I can say the end result could be, a one world organization that's looking to destabilize the United States and its supporting allies into submissives, bend the knee. But the only way you can do it is by making sure that the country is completely on its ass when it comes to political states, political control, when it comes to the social environment, when it comes to the economy, the forming and functioning of our government, the running of things. That's what you have to do first. As long as we have, or strangely enough, as long as we have functioning bureaucrats, we can get things done, because there's always going to be someone that's going to be pushing the paperwork and getting things signed and getting things authorized to do it. So if you want to make sure that the U.S. no longer has involvement in things outside of its playground, you have to get rid of that ability for it to function as a government. You have to create so much chaos and confusion that it has no other option but to shut everything else down. So, destabilizing the United States as a functioning country internally, creating factions and pockets fighting against each other. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, times 10. Having all that going on detracts and takes away from the focus of outside interests and incidents, such as the current conflicts that we're in, proxy wars and even overt wars. I'm less concerned about a good old-fashioned Cold War going hot nuclear level than I am about small pockets of dissent and internal problems. And even with the situation where you have on the border, you've got a large wave of, confirmed by our own government, our Border Patrol, that there's a larger number of, they call them military age men, crossing. Now, people can say, well, when people leave a country and they're, migrating, a lot of times, especially if they're leaving a country that is in a civil war or an active war, that, the women and children, we get the women and children and the elderly out first, and then the men stay. But the men that stay are usually staying to fight. So it wouldn't make sense for, a man in his 30s to send his wife and his children outside of the country because it's being invaded or it's in the middle of a civil war, to get them out of the country safely. And he's supposed to stay and fight, but then he leaves also separately with him and all his drinking buddies crossing into the country. That's completely illogical. If you think back just to immigrants coming into this country during the 1920s, 30s, 40s, all the way up through even the 80s, in many cases, and it's not a patriarchal thing, in many cases, the man would leave the country, come to the United States. They left their homeland. They came to the United States. They washed dishes. They swept floors. They slept on the floors that they swept. They worked 5 jobs. They built themselves up. They sent money back home. And then one day they were able to bring their family here to America, and they were living the American dream. That's usually the way it goes. It's not a case of, I send my family to a new country alone and I stay in our homeland hanging out, and then I come to that country by myself but with all my other buddies. That's not the logical path of things as they go. You can even look at Ukraine. Ukraine, a lot of people fled. But when you look at the initial wave of people fleeing during that time period, they were the women and the children and the elderly, and the men stayed. And many of them were conscripted. A lot of them volunteered, but they stayed to fight. So when you start having this group of fighting age men in their late teens to their mid 20s to even early 30s crossing the border, coming from countries that literally are not on our continent, that takes a lot of effort to get all the way across. No matter how you look at it, it takes more effort to get out of your continental area, across an ocean to another continent, and then make your way through all the way up to a third continent to then cross their border, just that way you can be here. That's a lot of hoops and hurdles to get through to do something like that. So it starts to make you think that if you were to be a group in some level organized and set to destabilize a country, you need to have operatives, saboteurs, people inside that country ready to do things. Some of it may be physical, some of it may be psychological, some of it may be to add to the numbers of the, as we say, actors in the scenario that you need. But if you're doing that and you're getting them in there, that's the way to do it. And then little by little, things start to happen, and you've got your ready-made force of chaos, your force multipliers already inbound. Then you're not having to worry about launching nukes. You're not having to worry about your aircraft carrier going up against the U.S.'s aircraft carrier fleets of multiple ships and other vessels. And you think on one aspect of it, we finished, as it were, with Afghanistan, and Iraq, a combination 20-year war fighting against a collective group that had no satellites. They had no aerial drones. They had no long-range missiles. They had no aircraft carriers. They had no air-to-air superiority fighters or bombers. They had no air-to-ground support. They didn't have attack groups. They didn't have armored cavalry. They didn't have long-range artillery. They effectively had a couple of mortars, rocket launchers, improvised explosives, and small arms and sandals. That's it. And they fought a 20-year war against, at that time and still today, the world's largest, most powerful military. Now, if you took that same level of fortitude and you placed that inside that very same country and you had the attacks going on from within it, it's a whole different level of chaos that can go on at that point in time. Because once again, you're having one large, completely lopsided, on paper, you would think, oh, they're going to win hands down because they got all the goods, going against a much smaller force. And that asymmetrical balance is not going to play out the way that we would think it would, because, you know, it hasn't before. It never does. Even when you think back to World War II, yes, you had multiple armies from different nations fighting it out on the battlefield, but a lot of the key critical points that were done by small groups. They were done by the commandos, but they were also done by the resistance forces in the Pacific and in Europe. You know, small groups of people moving amongst the rubble and the population, blending in, spying, getting information, setting up targets, destroying things, making it easier for the larger groups, because you can see a battalion of armored vehicles coming. You can spot a fighter wing coming in the air. It's a lot harder to work with or fight against a small group of 3 or 4 individuals, or a group of 10 people spread across a city that, you know, use marks of trade and tradecraft and spycraft to communicate and get things done. So if you have a group that you're putting into a country to help destabilize it, you're going to have people that are influencers on a political level. You're going to have the mouthpiece, the talking head, talking to the public, putting out a certain narrative story, getting the mind keyed into that one angle. Then you're going to have people that are behind the scenes, moving certain functions around, getting things made legal or illegal, so the civilian body has more red tape to get through, to navigate through. Maybe you catch some of them in that red tape and, you know, they get put away. And other people go, oh, I don't want to make the same mistake that person did, so let me not do this thing that got this person in trouble. And then, of course, you have the ground fighters, those that are just there to light the fires and kick over the cans and set everything ablaze. And they're out there and they're waiting to do what they need to do. All of that in small little groups build up to a larger situation, a larger operation, as it were, that could, in fact, be going on as you listen to this, as it goes on. And as I said before, I feel, and again, it's just my opinion, that that is something to look for coming up from July through August, going into the November election period, because there are far more chances of one thing going wrong that will quickly on its own spread out of control, because everyone is looking for someone to blame. That's the problem. Without rhyme, without reason, it's always going to be someone else's fault that something happened. And depending upon what that situation is, it may look clear and obvious that, oh, that's the bad guy there. That's the group there that caused the problem, and everything else falls into line. So it's a minimal effort investment. So it's what they will call a turnkey operation. You think about that for those startup businesses and franchises. That's kind of what terrorism has become. It's become a turnkey operation to be simply purchased by whoever wants to use it, whether you're a political group, whether you're some non-governmental organization, whether you're an individual. You just find the right program that you're looking for, and you can pretty much have it up and running with very little effort, very little investment, because we are all keyed and programmed into a certain group, a certain circle of operation that we all stay within. And those circles meander and move about, and they can become like Venn diagrams. Sometimes they overlap upon other circles, and you've got those key focal points that may spawn a new area of operation. But if something is to go on, it does not have to be a long, drawn out, overly complicated scenario that took years to plan. It could just simply be a new add-on to an existing program. It's almost like if you play video games, you buy the original game and you're playing that, and then there's an update, and then there's an add-on that you can download to your existing game that the update improves upon. It adds more to it. That's kind of like what it is. It's like the core of the game is still the same, but it's all the different add-ons and updates that occur over the decades and over the years and over the upcoming weeks and months that change the dynamic of things, that add a little bit more, put in a little extra that like, oh, that's new, that's different. And that is how certain things have been progressing. We are in that stage where you don't need to know who the man behind the curtain is, as it were, because the curtain is no longer there. We have passed that point. It is completely irrelevant who is behind the curtain. You can throw out names like Klaus Schwab and George Soros. And yes, to one extent, we see them, we hear the things that they talk about, and you look at their efforts and the things that they're in charge of, and you can definitely say, oh, they are definitely a player, but they're not the ones in charge. They're not the sole people responsible for all the bad that could happen. A lot of that is just becoming almost self-fulfilling to a certain extent. You just put the pieces out there and you have the basic code in the programming and you let it go and it develops on its own. That's kind of like what with AI that we're at now, using all the chat GTPs and things like that. You give it certain prompts with just the right amount of information, and then you let it develop the end result on its own. It comes up with its own picture, its own video, its own storyline based upon what you put in. And if it's not quite what you want, you tweak it, you add this, you take away that, you give it a little more precise instructions, and it will change that, parameter that you've got it set for, and it will make a new shift. So with false flags, as a whole, they're no longer going to have to be that shady individual in a trench coat that looks like a government agent doing something mysterious. It's kind of like the pipe bombs that they found outside the Democratic National Convention in D.C. A few years ago, where you have all these cameras all around DC, and they only have two vague images of this person at that location, nothing before and nothing after. That is not a tourist. That is not someone who has only walked the streets of DC for a couple of days mapping it out. That's someone who knew exactly where every camera was and had either control of the cameras to ensure that they were not looking in a certain area, or they had access to buildings to allow them to effectively pass in between cameras to get from one area to the next area without being tracked. Because anyone who's ever seen traffic cameras and security cameras for the streets around know that they're seeing multiple corners at multiple angles. So you can be 3 blocks away from an intersection, and if you have an accident at that intersection that you get to, they can actually look at the footage and see your line of travel from 3 blocks back. They can see what was going on before you even got there to make a determination as to who was at fault and what was going on. So for them not to be able to find basically a person that walked up a street, dropped a bomb off, and then walked away from that at a specific set period of time to look back through that footage doesn't make any sense. It means that to one extent or another, those that say that we have no further information may have further information, and either A, they're not releasing it because they're actively actually doing something in the investigation, or B, they are not releasing it because they're not supposed to release it because that information needs to stay quiet. Otherwise, the current plan that is going on is going to get, shall we say, segued or sidelined into something else. And again, that's the conspiracy aspect of it. When information is not full and complete and you can see that there are pieces that are missing, but the people that are supposed to have the answers just won't answer or won't give a plausible answer, it makes you question it. It would be far, far easier to say there was an actual problem with the security cameras on this block, and that's why that information isn't there. It's because the cameras were down. Here are the repair receipts. Here's whatever it is. Even if you think that it's a lie, at least you go, well, all right, fine. I'm not quite buying it, but I'll let it go. But when you simply say, oh, nope, that's all the footage that was there. This is it, nothing more. It is what it is. That's when people start questioning the motives and the reasoning behind it. And again, it's a complicated thing. There is no one simple answer to it. And like I said, I'm not making a prediction to say this is exactly what's going to happen because I don't have that inside info. I'm simply saying that this is what I see based upon the way things could possibly be going in these next few months. And, like I said, those are my bingo card picks for our upcoming election, and the scenarios to which it may occur might vary. It might be completely different in terms of what happens. But that's the way that I'm going with this, and that's what I'm leaning towards. It's not going to be a cool summer, as it were, where things just sort of go by and, everything's fine. And then, hey, we have an election and it's over and done. Because again, we have a long track history, and especially over the last 15, 20 years, that when things don't go quite the way that we want it, we're going to be vocal about it, and people are going to be getting upset one way or the other. There is no happy scenario to which no one is going to be angry or upset about what goes on. There's going to be some people that are going to be mad. There's going to be some people that are going to take action, and that is going to be the opportunity that if there were a cohesive network of people waiting to cause chaos, waiting to amplify the destruction, waiting to bring in the anarchy, that would be the time to do it. It's sort of like what's going to happen. You just have to sit, wait, and then it goes off. And that's all I got for you on this one. Now catch you in the next one.